Day 40. That is where the Department of Homeland Security shutdown stands as of yesterday, Wednesday. 260,000 federal employees, from TSA officers to Coast Guard members, are officially entering their second month of working without a paycheck. And yet, the congressional record shows the floor was dominated by a new $200 billion emergency request for the military escalation in Iran.
It is a massive figure to drop onto the floor while the domestic lights are still flickering. The transcript shows critics are already calling this excursion a looming quagmire, pointing to the contrast between funding a war abroad and the inability to fund paychecks for border agents at home. It's a tension that set the tone for the entire session.
We're digging into all of it in this full session. Beyond the shutdown and the war funding, the record from yesterday covers a surprisingly busy calendar. From the push to federalize gender-affirming care bans to a late-night scuffle over algorithmic pricing in the private sector.
We've also got the latest on the dog-led privacy overhaul and some very specific, very pointed quotes from Senator Richard Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, regarding the use of the Judgment Fund. We're going to touch on as many of these developments as possible to give you the complete picture of what your representatives were doing while the cameras were rolling.
There's a lot to unpack, and the clock is running. Let's jump straight into the heart of the gridlock, the 40-day impasse, DHS, and the hostage rhetoric. The legislative dam regarding the conflict in Iran finally broke yesterday, Wednesday. For weeks, we've heard whispers about the cost of Operation Epic Fury, but the administration formally sent a $200 billion supplemental funding request to the Senate. And the reaction on the floor was immediate and, frankly, pointed.
It's a massive number. To put that in perspective, Senator Peter Welch, a Democrat from Vermont, pointed out that this request is $60 billion higher than what President George W. Bush asked for to fund the initial months of the Iraq invasion back in 2003. Welch didn't hold back. He used the word sleepwalking to describe how the Senate is approaching this escalation.
He was very specific about the boots-on-the-ground aspect of this. According to the record, 3,000 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne are currently en route, joining 5,000 Marines being deployed from Japan and California. Senator Welch framed this as a move from a targeted strike to a full-blown regional entanglement. He said, "We are sleepwalking passively into a war that could be yet another war in the Middle East."
And he's connecting that deployment to the strategic failure regarding the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, the administration's line has been that the February 28 strikes, what they hit 8,000 targets, effectively decapitated the regime. But as Welch noted, the strait is closed, shipping has stopped, and the Iranian regime, while bloodied, is replacing its leaders as fast as they're lost.
The transcript shows he's also looking at the domestic bill. He calculated that $200 billion breaks down to a $1,400 tax on every single American household. That's on top of the spike in gas prices and home heating oil. It's a heavy lift to ask for that kind of money without a formal debate on the floor, which is exactly what he's calling for.
While Welch was sounding the alarm in the Senate, Representative Lloyd Doggett, a Democrat from Texas, was bringing a similar heat to the House floor. He had a particularly sharp way of describing the strategic situation. He said, "Iran has grabbed Trump by the Hormuz, with no path out of a quagmire that could be like Iraq, where we lost 4,400 service members and wasted over $2 trillion.
Doggett also hit on the opportunity cost of that $200 billion. He read off a list of what that money could buy instead: affordable health care for 22 million Americans, or fully funding VA health care for 9 million veterans for 2 years. He even mentioned it could double the budget for the National Institutes of Health. It was a very deliberate guns versus butter argument.
And the speaker pro tempore actually had to step in during Doggett's speech. Doggett was characterizing the president's motivations as being about ego and whims, and the chair reminded the members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. That tells you how high the temperature is getting in the House.
But it isn't just a chorus of opposition. We also saw Representative Joe Wilson, a Republican from South Carolina, take the floor to offer a complete counter-narrative. He's leaning into the peace through strength doctrine. He praised the administration for taking action to liberate the Iranian people after what he called 47 years of war on America and Israel.
Wilson is also drawing a direct line between Tehran and Moscow. He called Vladimir Putin a war criminal and argued that the instability we're seeing in the Middle East is fundamentally linked to Russian interests. He's essentially saying that if the U.S. doesn't project power now, it emboldens both regimes.
It's a stark contrast in the record. One side sees a reckless excursion, and the other sees a necessary stand against a global authoritarian cancer. But while the policy debate rages, the human cost of the last few weeks is starting to show up in the daily business of the chambers, through tributes and resolutions.
Right. The Senate actually passed Senate Resolution 648 yesterday, Wednesday. It was brought forward by Senator John Thune, a Republican from South Dakota, on behalf of Senator Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat from Minnesota. It's a formal honor for the 6 service members killed in that drone strike at Port Shuaiba, Kuwait, back on March 1st.
This resolution is significant because it's the first time we've seen the full list of names in a formal Senate action for this specific event. They honored Master Sergeant Nicole M. Amor of White Bear Lake, Minnesota. She was a 20-year veteran of the Army Reserve, posthumously promoted. The resolution also names Captain Cody A. Cork, Sergeant First Class Noah L. Teachins, Sergeant Declan J. Cody, Major Jeffrey R. O'Brien, and Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert M. Marzan.
And there were similar tributes in the House. Representative Taylor, a Republican from Ohio, stood to honor Captain Curtis Angst. He was a pilot for the 121st Refueling Wing. He died on March 12th when his KC-135 tanker crashed in Iraqi airspace during a mission for Operation Epic Fury.
The details Taylor shared really ground the policy in reality. Captain Angst was only 30. He was an aerospace engineer from the University of Cincinnati who grew up playing with toy planes in his yard. He had 880 flight hours and 67 combat hours. Taylor used the phrase, "America is the land of the free because of the brave," to close out his remarks.
Then you have Representative Eli Crank, a Republican from Colorado, honoring Sergeant Benjamin N. Pennington. He was killed on March 8th at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. He was only 26. Crank actually held up a drawing Pennington made in kindergarten that said, "I love America because I want to fight for my country."
It's those personal details, the kindergarten drawings, the Eagle Scout ranks,
that are filling the record alongside these $200 billion requests. It makes the sleepwalking warning from Senator Welch feel much more urgent when you see the faces of the people being sent over.
Which brings us to a very interesting tactical move by Senator Raphael Warnock, a Democrat from Georgia. He submitted an amendment yesterday, Senate Amendment 4783, that tries to bridge this gap between military needs and domestic friction.
This is a clever bit of legislative maneuvering. Warnock wants to take $2.9 billion in unobligated balances from ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, money that was originally part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act from last year. He wants to transfer that entire amount to the Secretary of Defense, specifically to supplement the basic allowance for housing for service members.
He's basically saying, if we're going to be deploying these troops and asking for $200 billion more for the war, we should at least use the money we already have sitting in ICE accounts to make sure their families can afford a place to live. It's a prioritize the troops move that puts the Republican majority in a tough spot because they've been pushing for massive ICE expansions.
The amendment was ordered to lie on the table, which means it isn't going anywhere immediately, but it sets a marker. It says to the administration, you can't ask for $200 billion for the excursion while leaving military families struggling with housing costs. It's a direct challenge to the budget priorities.
And that friction is appearing in the House too. Representative Kelly Morrison, a Democrat from Minnesota, gave a 1-minute speech that was incredibly blunt. She linked the troop deployments to the proposed 15% cut in the VA workforce. She called it a disgrace and a betrayal to send people to war while gutting the health care they'll need when they get back.
Morrison mentioned that these cuts would eliminate thousands of doctor and nurse positions at a time when VA hospitals are already in a staffing crisis. She claimed over 700,000 service members and veterans rely on the facilities that are at risk of collapse. It's the same unfunded mandate argument we're seeing across the board.
It's a fascinating dynamic. You have the administration calling this an excursion, a term Senator Welch pointedly mocked, while the military is asking for a funding level that suggests a generational conflict. And Congress is caught between honoring the fallen and questioning the math.
The terminology really matters here. By calling it an excursion, the White House is trying to avoid certain War Powers Act triggers. But when you're sending the 82nd Airborne and asking for $200 billion, excursion starts to sound like a very thin euphemism to the people on the floor.
And the Strait of Hormuz is the wild card. As Welch mentioned, if the shipping lanes stay closed, the economic pressure at home is going to outpace the political will in D.C. very quickly. Farmers in Vermont and Utah are already seeing a 35% jump in fertilizer costs, just as planting season starts. That's the kind of detail that turns a foreign policy debate into a local crisis.
The record shows a body that is starting to realize the 4 to 5 week war they were promised is entering its second month with no clear exit strategy. Whether it's Warnock trying to shift ICE money to housing or Doggett tallying up the cost of Pell Grants, the focus is shifting from the initial stunning display of power to the long-term bill, both in blood and treasure.
It's the pivot from the shock and awe phase to the how do we pay for this phase. And yesterday, Wednesday, was the day that reality really settled into the congressional record.
Now, while the debate over the cost of war dominated the morning, the afternoon shift on the Hill turned toward a completely different kind of battle. One happening right here at home, over who gets to vote and how those votes are counted.
This is the voting rights war we've been tracking. And yesterday, Wednesday, it hit a new flashpoint with a series of competing bills on proof of citizenship and independent redistricting commissions.
Yesterday, Wednesday, March 25th, the Senate floor became the site of a very narrow, very consequential procedural showdown. The transcript from late in the day shows a 48-50 vote that effectively ended a major effort to roll back the Trump administration's restrictions on reproductive health care within the Department of Veterans Affairs.
This was the vote on the motion to proceed to Senate Joint Resolution 103. It's a Congressional Review Act resolution, which is that specific tool Congress uses to try and overturn executive branch rules. In this case, they were targeting a rule implemented on New Year's Eve that established what critics are calling a near-total ban on abortion services and counseling at the VA.
The roll call shows it was a strictly partisan split, with 50 Republicans voting against moving forward and 48 Democrats in favor. Two senators, John Curtis, a Republican from Utah, and Brian Schatz, a Democrat from Hawaii, were recorded as not voting. Because it failed to reach a simple majority, the resolution is essentially dead for the session, leaving those VA restrictions firmly in place.
And the debate leading up to that vote was particularly intense. Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, argued that this policy change was implemented secretively and that it targets the fastest-growing demographic in the military, women. He pointed out that many of these veterans are survivors of sexual assault or have service-connected disabilities that make pregnancy a high-risk situation.
Blumenthal read several stories from veterans into the record. One was from an Air Force veteran named Alex, a sexual assault survivor who suffered a miscarriage that nearly cost her her life. She told him that because of these new restrictions, she and her husband are terrified to try and get pregnant again, because they don't feel they can trust the VA to provide life-saving intervention if something goes wrong.
There's a specific focus on the counseling aspect of this rule as well. Senator Mazie Hirono, a Democrat from Hawaii, and Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, both characterized the policy as a gag order. They argued that by preventing VA providers from even discussing pregnancy options, the government is denying veterans the basic ability to make informed decisions about their own health.
Senator Shaheen highlighted a really striking statistic during her remarks to underscore the gravity of the situation for this specific population. She said, and I'm quoting the record here, 1 in 3 of our nation's female veterans has reported experiencing military sexual trauma during their service. She argued that for these survivors, being denied reproductive health care from the very agency tasked with their recovery is a fundamental betrayal.
On the other side of the aisle, the argument was that these rules align the VA with broader federal policies on abortion funding. While we didn't see a lengthy defense from the Republican side during this specific motion to proceed, the 50 votes against the resolution show a unified front in keeping the Trump administration's policy in place. It's a clear signal that the post-Roe battles have moved into the administrative heart of the federal government.
While that gridlock held firm in the Senate, the House was marking a different kind of healthcare milestone. Representative Sarah McBride, a Democrat from Delaware, took to the floor to recognize the 16th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act. But this wasn't just a celebration. It was a sharp critique of the current fiscal trajectory.
McBride was very specific about the sabotage she sees happening. She pointed out that while the ACA has provided coverage to over 50 million people, the expiration of enhanced tax credits and the recent cuts to Medicaid are creating a massive financial burden for families. She used a phrase that's likely to be echoed in campaign ads. She called these costs a tax on staying alive.
She specifically connected these healthcare cuts to the broader Republican budget priorities, arguing that funding is being diverted to mass deportation efforts and tax breaks for billionaires. It's a framing that we're seeing more frequently as the 119th Congress navigates these reconciliation battles. She's essentially arguing that taking away a tax credit is the functional equivalent of a tax hike on the middle class.
It is interesting to see that rhetoric heat up, just as we're seeing some rare bipartisan movement on a different healthcare front. In the Senate, John Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming, introduced S-4202 yesterday. It's called the Mental Health Access and Provider Support Act of 2026, and he has a solid group of co-sponsors from both sides, including Democrat Chris Coons of Delaware and Republican Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia.
The mechanism in this bill is straightforward, but could have a huge impact. It proposes changing the Medicare reimbursement rate for certain mental health providers. Right now, many are paid at 75% of the psychologist fee schedule. This bill would bump that up to 85% starting in January of 2027.
That 10% jump might sound like a technicality, but if you look at the HRSA data from the end of last year, the provider shortage is actually getting worse. We're talking about nearly 140 million Americans living in areas with a shortage of mental health professionals. Barrasso's team is betting that this reimbursement increase will be the incentive needed to get more clinicians to actually accept Medicare patients.
It's a rare moment where both parties agree on the how, using reimbursement rates to solve a workforce crisis. But as we saw with the VA vote, that bipartisan spirit ends the moment the conversation shifts to reproductive rights or the fundamental structure of the ACA.
Exactly. You have one side of the Capitol debating the survival of the ACA, and the other side failing to even move forward on a resolution about veteran health care. It's a bifurcated reality. One minute we're talking about bipartisan tweaks to Medicare fees, and the next we're seeing a total procedural block on a policy affecting 500,000 women veterans.
And that tension between technical fixes and ideological standoffs is something we're going to see play out in our next story too. But the focus shifts from the doctor's office to the server room.
That's right. Coming up, we're looking at how the surge in AI is putting a massive strain on the nation's power grid, and the new push in Congress to protect everyday ratepayers from footing the bill for these massive data centers.
The transition from doctors' offices to data centers might seem like a leap, but in the halls of Congress, they're actually part of the same puzzle. How do you manage explosive demand when the infrastructure is already at its breaking point? Yesterday, Wednesday, that conversation moved squarely into the server room.
And the numbers here are staggering. We're talking about an appetite for power that we haven't seen since the Industrial Revolution. In 2024, data centers took up about 4% of the nation's electricity. But the Department of Energy projects that could triple to 12% by 2028. Think about that. 1 out of every 8 kilowatt-hours in the entire country just to keep the AI models running.
That projection is exactly what sparked a new bipartisan push in the Senate. Senator Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida, and Senator Roger Marshall, a Republican from Kansas, introduced Senate Concurrent Resolution 30. It's an endorsement of something called the Ratepayer Protection Pledge that several tech giants signed earlier this month.
The list of signatories is essentially a who's who of Silicon Valley. Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, Oracle, and xAI. But what's interesting is why Rick Scott is championing this. Usually, you don't see a conservative from Florida cheering on a voluntary pledge from tech companies unless there's a very specific economic hook.
The hook is the checkbook of the average American household. The resolution notes that under the traditional utility regulatory model, the cost of building new transmission lines and power plants is socialized. That's the term they used in the record. It means the costs are spread across everyone's monthly bill.
Right. So if a massive data center moves into a rural county and requires a billion-dollar grid upgrade, your grandmother's electric bill in that same county might go up to help pay for it. The resolution actually pulls no punches on this. It says households and small businesses in the United States effectively subsidize the electricity infrastructure of some of the most highly capitalized companies in history.
It's a blunt way to put it. The pledge itself, which the Senate is now formally endorsing, commits these companies to a pay-whether-used model. Basically, they agree to negotiate separate rate structures where they pay for the infrastructure they require, regardless of how much energy they're actually pulling at any given second.
It also turns these data centers into a bit of a safety net. Part of the pledge involves making their massive on-site backup generators available to the public grid during energy shortages. It's an attempt to turn a massive energy drain into a potential source of reliability when the grid is peaking.
But while the Scott-Marshall resolution is all about the carrot of voluntary pledges, Senator Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, introduced the stick yesterday, Wednesday. He's looking for something a lot more mandatory with Senate Bill 4213, the Data Center Water and Energy Transparency Act of 2026.
Durbin is going after the data. If you're running a facility that pulls more than 25 megawatts, which is a lot of power, you would have to start reporting exactly how much juice and how much water you're using. And he wants metrics that most people have probably never heard of: PUE and WUE.
Power usage effectiveness and water usage effectiveness. The transcript shows Durbin wants these facilities to provide 5-year projections of their resource use and, crucially, their plans for efficiency. It's not just about what they're using now, but how they're going to stop using quite so much of it in the future.
And the enforcement here has real teeth. If you're a data center operator and you're negligent in reporting this data to the EPA or the Department of Energy, the bill authorizes a fine of $20,000 per day. For a company like Microsoft, that might look like a rounding error, but over a year, that's over $7 million. It sends a message that the federal government is done asking nicely for these stats.
Durbin's focus on water is what really catches the eye here. We often talk about the grid, but these servers generate massive heat. They need millions of gallons of water for cooling. In some of these Western states, where water is more precious than gold, a new data center isn't just a power concern, it's a drought concern.
It's also about local control. The bill sets up a tiered system where states are the primary collectors of this data. If a state doesn't have a program, only then does the federal government step in. It allows places like Virginia or Arizona, which are essentially the data center capitals of the world, to keep their own books, provided they actually do it.
It's a rare moment where you see the Senate moving on 2 tracks at once. You have the Republicans pushing for a ratepayer protection pledge to make sure companies pay their fair share of the bills. And you have the Democrats pushing for a transparency mandate to see exactly how big those bills should be.
And Durbin isn't just focused on data centers. He also introduced a joint resolution yesterday, Wednesday, targeting a very different kind of protection. He's using the Congressional Review Act to try and block a move by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
This is Senate Joint Resolution 147. It's a direct challenge to the CFPB's recent decision to withdraw its policy statement on abusive acts or practices. If you follow the regulatory world, this is a big deal. For years, the CFPB has been trying to define what abusive actually means in a legal sense when it comes to banks and lenders.
Right, because unfair and deceptive have decades of case law behind them. But abusive was the new kid on the block from the Dodd-Frank era. The current leadership at the CFPB has been pulling back on those definitions, arguing they were too broad or created too much uncertainty for financial institutions. Durbin's resolution essentially says, no, you don't. If it passes, it would legally prevent the CFPB from ever issuing a similar withdrawal again.
It's a fascinating bit of procedural gymnastics. Durbin is using a tool, the Congressional Review Act, that is almost always used by the party out of power to kill rules from the sitting administration. Here, he's using it to protect an old standard by killing the new rule that tried to rescind it. It shows just how much the fight over consumer protection has shifted into these technical procedural battles.
It all ties back to the same theme we're seeing all over the record from yesterday, Wednesday. Who is looking out for the consumer? Whether it's your electric bill or your bank account, there's a sense in the Senate that the guardrails are being tested by these massive shifts in technology and policy.
While the Senate was debating long-term grid reliability and regulatory definitions, the House was focused on a much more immediate price point. Representative Chris Pappas, a Democrat from New Hampshire, took to the floor for a 1-minute speech that really highlighted the mood of his district right now.
Pappas was talking about gas prices, and the numbers he cited are pretty startling. He said that since the conflict in Iran escalated, the national average for a gallon of gas has jumped 35% in just 30 days. It's sitting at $3.98 a gallon right now.
He described it as simply unsustainable for his constituents in the Granite State. He pointed out that this isn't happening in a vacuum. People are already dealing with high grocery costs and rising health insurance premiums. He actually linked those premium hikes to the expiration of the ACA tax credits we were talking about in the previous arc.
So his solution is the Gas Prices Relief Act of 2026. He's working on this with Senator Mark Kelly, a Democrat from Arizona. The bill would suspend the federal gas tax, that's about 18 cents a gallon, all the way through September. The idea is to give people a summer of lower costs while the global oil market tries to stabilize.
The skepticism usually aimed at gas tax holidays is that oil companies will just pocket the difference instead of lowering the price at the pump. Pappas addressed that directly. He said his bill holds the oil and gas companies accountable if they fail to pass along the savings to consumers.
He also has to solve the problem of the Highway Trust Fund. Usually, that 18-cent tax is what pays for every bridge and road project in the country. Pappas claims the bill has a mechanism to keep that funding intact, though the record doesn't specify exactly where that replacement money is coming from. It's that classic political dilemma. Everyone wants the tax cut, but no one wants the potholes.
It's a tough needle to thread, especially when you have other members like Senator John Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming, focusing on a different kind of cost. He introduced S-4202 yesterday, Wednesday, the Mental Health Access and Provider Support Act.
Barrasso is a physician by trade, so he usually hones in on the Medicare fee schedules. His bill is looking to adjust how much Medicare pays for mental health services. It would move the reimbursement rate for certain psychologists from 75% of the standard fee schedule up to 85% starting in 2027.
It's a 10% bump, which sounds small until you realize that mental health providers have been fleeing the Medicare system for years because the pay is so much lower than private insurance. It's another example of Congress trying to use a very small lever, a decimal point in a fee schedule, to solve a massive access crisis.
You see this across the entire record from Wednesday. Whether it's the 25 megawatt threshold for data centers, the 18-cent gas tax, or the 10% bump for Medicare psychologists, Congress is basically a giant control room right now, and members are frantically turning every dial they can find to try and lower the temperature on the cost of living.
Even the symbolic stuff had a bit of that flavor. Senator Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey, got a resolution passed recognizing the 205th anniversary of Greek independence. It was a unanimous vote, very bipartisan, but even there, the research context shows they were talking about energy security in the Eastern Mediterranean.
It all comes back to the same theme: stability. Whether it's supporting an ally like Greece to ensure energy flows in Europe, or forcing OpenAI to pay for a new substation in Iowa, the 119th Congress is obsessively focused on the logistics of modern life.
It's a realization that the digital world of AI and the financial world of the CFPB are ultimately tied to very physical things: gallons of water, kilowatt hours of power, and the price at the pump in New Hampshire.
And while the Senate is looking at the high-tech future of power, the House is turning its attention to a much older form of energy and a much older part of the American economy. Because if you think the debate over data centers is intense, wait until you hear what's happening with the farmers who are seeing their own land transformed by these same forces.
That's exactly where we're headed next. We're moving from the server room to the grain elevator. Up next, we're looking at agriculture and the Heartland reckoning, where the fight over land use, trade tariffs, and the next farm bill is coming to a head. The transition from the digital cloud to the dusty cornfield is shorter than you'd think. Yesterday, Wednesday, March 25th, the House floor became a sounding board for a looming economic crisis that connects the Strait of Hormuz directly to the fuel tanks of tractors in the American Midwest.
It's a classic case of global logistics hitting the kitchen table. We've been tracking the volatility in the Middle East, but Representative Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, brought the reality of that conflict home with some pretty sobering numbers for the agriculture sector. She's calling it a perfect storm.
Kaptur pointed out that after 2 years of record drought and the lingering scars of trade tariffs, the Heartland is now facing a massive spike in input costs. She noted that 1/3 of the world's fertilizer supply and 25% of the global oil supply pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Because these are global commodities, any friction off the coast of Iran sends ripples into every farm in her district.
And the timing couldn't be worse. We are right at the start of the spring planting season. If you're a farmer in Ohio or Iowa, you're looking at a national average for diesel that just hit $5.37 per gallon. That isn't a theoretical statistic. That's a massive overhead cost that has to be paid before a single seed even hits the ground.
The transcript shows Kaptur was visibly urgent about this. She said, "Our agriculture sector is teetering on the brink. Family farms hang in the balance. For many, this is a make-or-break year." She ended her remarks with a direct challenge. Is the White House, hello, are you paying attention?
That pay attention line is a signal that the usual bipartisan consensus on agriculture is fraying under the weight of these costs. Usually, the Farm Bill is where the two parties find common ground. But right now, the disagreement over where the money should go is reaching a fever pitch.
That friction was front and center when Representative Angie Craig, a Democrat from Minnesota, took the floor. She's the ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee, and she is sounding the alarm over a $200 billion cut to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. In the record, she characterized these as reckless attacks on the country's most efficient anti-hunger program.
What's striking here is the trade-off being described. Craig and other Democrats are highlighting that while nutrition assistance is being slashed, that funding is being diverted. Specifically, she noted that while nearly $200 billion is leaving SNAP, $75 billion is being allocated to immigration and customs enforcement for mass deportations.
She brought a very visual piece of advocacy to the floor yesterday. She highlighted that Maison, a Jewish response to hunger, delivered over 47,000 handwritten postcards to the USDA. These weren't just form letters. They were from individuals, synagogues, and schools across the country protesting the cuts.
Craig's argument is that these cuts don't just affect the 4 million people potentially losing benefits. They destabilize the entire agricultural economy. SNAP is a massive driver of demand for American-grown food. When you pull that much purchasing power out of the grocery store, the farmer at the other end of the supply chain feels the pinch too.
She was very specific about the administrative changes too, mentioning a 30% reduction in USDA staff and the relocation of regional offices. According to Craig, these postcards flooding USDA sent a clear message that no one deserves to go hungry, and SNAP must be protected, not cut.
It's a fundamental split in philosophy. One side sees these programs as bloated and ripe for redirection toward border security, while the other sees them as the foundational floor that keeps both families and the farming economy upright.
And Representative Jim McGovern, a Democrat from Massachusetts, added another layer to this during his End Hunger Now update. He focused on teen hunger, which he says is often overlooked because teens are frequently more mobile and less visible in traditional social service settings than younger children.
McGovern has been on a statewide tour, and he visited the Blue Spoon Community Kitchen and a freight farm at the Boys and Girls Club of Metro South. He spoke about teen ambassadors who are actually learning to grow food in these high-tech shipping containers. It's an interesting contrast. While Captor is worried about the global fertilizer market for massive fields, McGovern is looking at these localized freight farms as a way to bridge the nutrition gap.
He issued a specific challenge to his colleagues before the upcoming recess. He said, "I urge every member of Congress to take some time during the upcoming recess to visit with youth leaders in their communities. Learn from them about how we can improve their food security and end hunger now."
It's worth noting how much recess homework gets assigned on the floor. McGovern wants members to see the faces behind the SNAP statistics before they come back for the next round of Farm Bill markups.
But it wasn't all economic anxiety and policy battles in the Heartland yesterday. Representative Don Davis, a Democrat from North Carolina, spent 5 minutes celebrating some much-needed good news from his district. He was honoring several high school basketball teams that just clinched state championships.
This is where you see the cultural heartbeat of these rural districts. Davis went through a literal roster of excellence. You had Kinston High School winning their 12th state title. That's a dynasty. Then Northern Nash High School won their first boys title since 1968 in a 61-60 overtime nail-biter.
And Wilson Prep made history with their first ever girls title. Davis was very intentional about framing these wins as community achievements. He said, "Thank you for making Eastern North Carolina so proud and representing our communities on and off the court with excellence."
In a region that's dealing with population shifts and economic recovery, those Friday night lights and championship trophies are powerful social glue. It's a reminder that these towns are more than just line items in an agricultural subsidy debate.
Speaking of deep community roots, we also saw a tribute to St. Helena, California. Representative Mike Thompson, a Democrat from California, rose to recognize the city's 150th anniversary. It was incorporated back on March 24, 1876.
St. Helena is really the epicenter of the Napa Valley wine industry. Thompson's remarks traced the history from the indigenous Wapo people to the founders of Beringer and Krug. It's a classic American story of an agricultural settlement evolving into a global hospitality hub.
He also highlighted the St. Helena Public Library, which was actually built with the help of Andrew Carnegie. Thompson noted, "The city of St. Helena has had a profound impact on our community and our community on the city." It's that 150-year perspective that reminds us how long these agricultural legacies take to build.
It also highlights the stakes. Whether it's the wine growers in Napa or the grain farmers in Ohio, they are all navigating a world that feels increasingly volatile. When Representative Capter asks if the White House is paying attention, she's speaking for a sector that feels like it's being asked to feed the world, while the ground is shifting beneath its feet.
It really brings the Heartland reckoning into focus. You have the immediate pressure of $5 diesel and the geopolitical threat of the Strait of Hormuz, clashing with the long-term policy fight over how much of the federal safety net should be dedicated to nutrition versus other priorities like border security.
Exactly. And while those macro debates rage on, the local stories, the basketball championships in North Carolina, or the sesquicentennial in St. Helena, remind us why people fight so hard for these communities in the first place.
It's a lot to balance, and the House floor yesterday showed just how many different directions those pressures are coming from. But as we move from the fields and the small-town gyms, we're seeing a different kind of tension building elsewhere.
That's right. We're heading from the rural landscapes of the Heartland into the very heart of the capital itself, because while farmers are worried about their land, some lawmakers are becoming increasingly worried about the city they work in.
Up next, we're looking at safety, beauty, and overreach in D.C., where the debate over how the nation's capital is governed is starting to feel very personal for the people who live and work there. Yesterday, Wednesday, in the Senate, there was a moment that felt like a complete departure from the gridlock we've been tracking. If you look at the transcript from the afternoon session, Senator Jim Justice, a Republican from West Virginia, actually stopped his floor speech to point toward the gallery. High above the floor, 4 men were standing: Major General Patrick Brady, Lieutenant Colonel William Swenson, Command Master Chief Britt Kelly Slabinski, and Sergeant Major Thomas Payne. All 4 of them are Medal of Honor recipients.
It's a powerful image, especially considering the rarity of that award. We're talking about the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. And they weren't just there for a photo op. They were watching the Senate finally move on S-858, which is the Herschel Woody Williams National Medal of Honor Monument Location Act. It's a bill that's been caught in the gears for a while, but it finally cleared the chamber by unanimous consent.
And the naming is significant. Herschel Woody Williams was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, before he passed away in 2022. This legislation effectively designates the exact spot for a permanent monument on the National Mall. But it's not just any spot. The bill specifically places it within what's known as the Reserve.
Right. And for anyone who doesn't spend their life reading Title 40 of the U.S. Code, the Reserve is essentially the most protected real estate in the country. It's the great cross-section of the mall, where the major monuments, Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, already sit. Under the Commemorative Works Act, there's actually a general prohibition against building anything new in that specific area. Congress has to pass a law to override that, which is exactly what this bill does.
The transcript shows Senator Justice acknowledged that this took some serious behind-the-scenes negotiation. He specifically credited his conversations with Ranking Member Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico, along with Senators Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, and Alex Padilla, a Democrat from California. Justice had a really interesting way of framing it. He said, "If we talked and we trusted and we absolutely told the truth to one another, there may just be passage of lots and lots and lots of stuff that we should be doing here." He even referred to the average voters back home as Toby and Edith, saying they need the Senate to stop a little bit of the food fight.
It's a rare sentiment lately. And it wasn't just the Senate moving on this. Over in the House, Representative Blake Moore, a Republican from Utah, led a special order yesterday, Wednesday, specifically for National Medal of Honor Day. He pointed out that while over 40 million Americans have served since the Civil War, fewer than 4,000 have received this medal. He shared the story of Petty Officer George Edward Wallen from Utah, who was at Iwo Jima. Wallen was wounded 3 times, but kept crawling across the battlefield to treat other Marines. He even quoted Harry Truman, who once said he'd rather have that medal than be president.
Moore was pushing the Senate to act, noting the House had already passed the monument bill 414-0. But while the monument was the big symbolic victory, there was a secondary, more immediate development in the record. The clerk of the House, Kevin McCumber, reported that 3 specific bills to award the Medal of Honor were presented to the president on March 24th.
These are the individual authorizations that have to happen when the standard statutory time limits have expired. Usually, these awards have to be processed within a few years of the Act of Valor, but for these 3 men, Congress had to step in to waive those rules. We're talking about H.R. 3377 for James Capers Jr., H.R. 7211 for John W. Ripley, and H.R. 7194 for Kareem N. Dockery.
The James Capers Jr. story is one that advocates have been pushing for decades. He was a legendary figure in the Marine Corps, a pioneering Black reconnaissance officer who led Team Broad-Minded in Vietnam. In April 1967, his team was ambushed near Phu Loc. Capers was hit by 17 pieces of shrapnel and sustained 2 gunshot wounds. Even with a broken leg, he stayed on the ground directing his team's defense and calling in airstrikes until everyone was evacuated. He's still alive today, and this bill finally clears the path for him to receive the honor while he can actually attend the ceremony.
The John Ripley case is similar in its historical weight. He's famous for Ripley at the Bridge, where he spent 3 hours under intense fire in 1972, hand-placing 500 pounds of explosives to blow up the Dong Ha Bridge and stop a North Vietnamese tank column. He passed away in 2008, so his award will be posthumous, as will the award for Kareem Dockery. Dockery was an Army specialist who showed incredible bravery in Afghanistan in 2012. He was part of a small team that came under heavy fire, and he repeatedly exposed himself to save his fellow soldiers.
It is fascinating to see these threads come together on the same day. You have the Senate clearing the site for a national monument, and the House finalizing the individual authorizations for heroes from 3 different wars: Vietnam, World War II via the monument's name, and Afghanistan. The monument itself won't use federal funds. The National Medal of Honor Museum Foundation is going to raise the money privately, but they needed that congressional okay to use that specific reserve land on the mall.
And that location really matters. By putting it in the reserve, they're saying these acts of valor belong in the same physical conversation as the founding of the country. Senator Justice mentioned that the monument isn't supposed to be about one person, but about the medal itself and what it represents. It's meant to be a respectful extension of the legacy that Lincoln started when he signed the original Medal of Honor legislation into law in 1862.
There was also a bit of a procedural lesson in how this happened. Justice moved to discharge the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources from both the Monument Bill and a separate piece of legislation from Senator Padilla, S. 1142, which adjusts the boundaries for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. They passed them en bloc, which is Senate speak for all at once, without a recorded vote. It shows that when the food fight stops, as Justice put it, the chamber can move remarkably fast.
It's worth noting that the monument will be situated near the Lincoln Memorial. For the 61 living recipients, seeing this pass is a race against time. Representative Moore mentioned that in the House, noting how few of these heroes are left to tell their stories. By waiving the Commemorative Works Act's usual restrictions, Congress is basically admitting that some things are too important for the standard 10-year waiting period for site selection.
Exactly. Now that both chambers have aligned on the monument location and the president has those 3 individual authorization bills on his desk, the focus shifts to the White House for the signatures. It's a rare bit of unanimous consent in a session that has otherwise been defined by some pretty sharp elbows.
And speaking of those individual connections, Representative David Kustoff, a Republican from Tennessee, also took some time during that same special order to honor a local hero who never received a Medal of Honor, but spent his life serving those who did. He spoke about Steve Stampson, a Marine Vietnam veteran from Memphis, who passed away earlier this month. Stampson was a longtime election commissioner and juvenile court clerk.
Kustoff's tribute really grounded the high-level talk about monuments in the reality of community service. He said of Stampson, "If you knew Steve, you knew his door was always open. His handshake was sincere, and his word actually meant something. It served as a reminder that the military service we see honored on the mall often translates back into decades of quiet, local work once those veterans come home.
That's a perfect bridge to what we saw elsewhere in the record. Because while the Senate was focused on these national symbols of valor, the House spent a good chunk of the day dealing with the people who keep those local communities running.
Which leads us directly to the local ledger, ranging from aerospace pioneers to the community pillars who make those cities work. The mechanical work of government can feel invisible compared to the fire and fury of the funding battles we've been tracking. But the record from yesterday, Wednesday, shows that the gears never actually stop turning. While the leaders are arguing over billions, the floor is still processing the people and the paperwork that keep the building upright.
It's like the engine room of a ship. You might be focused on the storm on the horizon, but if someone isn't down there making sure the valves are turning and the pressure is right, the ship isn't going anywhere. We saw a lot of that pressure maintenance in the House yesterday, Wednesday, through a wave of committee resignations.
Exactly. Representative Rich McCormick, a Republican from Georgia, formally stepped down from the Foreign Affairs Committee. He's a physician and a Marine, and he put his departure in those terms, saying, "As a Marine and a physician, I have always believed that when duty calls, you show up." He's not leaving the House, just shifting his focus, but it's a notable loss of a specific kind of veteran expertise on that committee.
And he wasn't the only one shuffling the deck chairs. Representative Troy Downing, a Republican from Montana, and Representative Nick LaLota, a Republican from New York, both resigned from the Small Business Committee. In LaLota's case, he's heading back to the Homeland Security Committee. Given the current chaos over DHS funding, that's moving toward the sound of the guns, legislatively speaking.
Then, you had Representative Max L. Miller, a Republican from Ohio, resigning from the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. These are often the first steps in a broader internal reorganization. When you see 4 members drop committee assignments in a single day, the leadership is usually clearing the way for new appointments or reacting to a shift in caucus priorities.
It's the administrative version of cleaning out the locker before a big game. And speaking of preparation, the House chaplain, Reverend Margaret Grun-Kibben, touched on the emotional state of the chamber in her opening prayer. She specifically called out the human tendency toward impatience and the desire for rapid resolutions. It felt very pointed, given the legislative deadlock.
She didn't mince words. The transcript shows she prayed, "Happy are those who trust in you, who do not turn to voices of pride or power, or to the false gods that promise easy fixes and short-term gain." That's a heavy sentiment to drop on a group of people currently trying to navigate a partial government shutdown.
It's an appeal for the long view in a town that's obsessed with the next 15 minutes. But while the chaplain was asking for patience, the legislative hopper was being filled at an incredible rate. We saw 22 public bills introduced in the House yesterday, Wednesday, and another 34 in the Senate. That's a massive amount of new policy hitting the record.
The variety is what stands out. You have Representative Lauren Underwood, a Democrat from Illinois, introducing H.R. 8070 to expand suicide prevention programs. Then, you have Representative Alma Adams, a Democrat from North Carolina, leading a huge coalition on H.R. 8074, which is a massive push to end preventable maternal mortality. It's a dense package focused on data collection and diversifying the perinatal workforce.
On the other side of the aisle, you have Representative Ashley Hinson, a Republican from Iowa, introducing bills to increase access to oral contraceptives, while also calling for a GAO study on how federal funding for contraception is being used. It's this constant push-pull, where both parties are identifying the same problems, maternal health, pharmacy access, but offering very different structural solutions.
And it wasn't just healthcare. We saw some unexpected bipartisan pairings in the Senate. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, and Senator Josh Hawley, a Republican from Missouri, introduced S. 4185. It's a bill aimed at ending tax-free treatment for corporate reorganizations involving large corporations. When White House and Hawley agree that big corporations are getting too much of a break, that's a signal that the populist wing of both parties is looking for a fight.
That is a fascinating thread to pull. It's also interesting to see what the tech world is facing. Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent from Vermont, introduced S4214, which would actually impose a moratorium on the construction of new data centers until Congress passes legislation to safeguard the public from the dangers of artificial intelligence. He's literally trying to pull the plug on the physical infrastructure of AI.
Which contrasts with what Senator Rick Scott, a Republican from Florida, is doing. He introduced a resolution supporting a ratepayer protection pledge to make sure that as those same AI data centers expand, they aren't driving up electricity costs for everyone else. One side wants to stop the building, the other side wants to make sure the neighbors don't pay the power bill for it.
It's a classic infrastructure fight, just with servers instead of highways. And speaking of infrastructure, we saw a message from the House to the Senate yesterday, Wednesday, transmitting 14 different bills. Most of them are about aviation. Things like civil supersonic flight, drone incursions on wildfire suppression, and digital documentation in the supply chain.
That's the administrative machine in full effect. These bills often pass the House with huge bipartisan majorities because they're technical. H.R. 2247, for example, just allows the FAA to use digital copies of certificates during inspections. It sounds small, but it's the kind of modernization that actually changes how a federal agency functions on a Tuesday morning in a regional office.
Right. It's the grease in the gears. But as those gears turn, the people turning them change. We saw a really touching tribute from Representative Glenn Thompson, a Republican from Pennsylvania, for David J. Salmonson. He's retiring after 29 years as a trade expert for the American Farm Bureau Federation. He was the guy at the table for the WTO Doha talks and the USMCA.
Thompson really emphasized Salmonson's roots, noting he grew up on a dairy farm in New York. He said, David Salmonson leaves behind a legacy of expanded markets, fairer trade, and a stronger future for American agriculture. When you lose someone with 3 decades of institutional memory, just as we're entering a new era of trade wars, that's a quiet but significant shift in the balance of power in Washington.
It's the departure of the cleared advisors, the people who actually know where the bodies are buried in a 3,000-page trade agreement. Another transition we saw was the House paying tribute to John R. Forbes. He's leaving the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense to become the clerk for the Senate side of Military Construction and Veterans Affairs.
Representative Ken Calvert, a Republican from California, credited Forbes with being essential in developing the first full-year continuing resolution for defense back in fiscal year 2025. This is the kind of staff-level expertise that bridges the gap between the two chambers. He's a former Air Force commander who's now going to be the guy holding the pen for the Senate on veteran housing and base construction.
These are the people who keep the building running, while the principals are doing cable news hits. We also saw the Senate receiving a massive list of nominations. 29 Army colonels were tapped for promotion to brigadier general, plus a long list of foreign service officers being moved into positions from career minister down to counselor. It's the constant replenishment of the diplomatic and military corps.
And while the Senate was processing those career tracks, they also took time for some symbolic diplomacy. Senator Cory Booker, a Democrat from New Jersey, led a bipartisan group of 16 senators in passing a resolution for the 205th anniversary of Greek independence. It's a staple of the congressional calendar. But the record yesterday, Wednesday, included some great historical deep dives.
They were quoting Thomas Jefferson's letters to Greek scholars from 1823. Booker's resolution notes that the Greek War of Independence was such a huge deal for the American founders that individual Americans, including early abolitionists, actually traveled to Greece to fight alongside them.
The quote that stood out to me was from Winston Churchill, which they read into the record. No longer will we say that Greeks fight like heroes, but that heroes fight like Greeks. Beyond the history, the resolution explicitly mentions the modern strategic partnership, the Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act. It's a way of saying we remember the 1820s, but we're also very focused on natural gas and NATO in the 2020s.
It's a reminder that even these symbolic resolutions have a hard edge of geopolitical reality to them. Now, on a much more domestic note, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, a Democrat from New Hampshire, used her time to highlight National Area Health Education Centers Week. This sounds like a routine commemorative week story, but the numbers she cited are terrifying.
The physician shortage. She noted that the U.S. is on track for a deficit of up to 124,000 doctors by 2034. She's using this week to argue for more funding for AHECs, which are the programs that actually train medical students in rural and underserved areas. She pointed out that students who train in those communities are statistically far more likely to stay there once they're licensed.
It's a workforce pipeline issue. If you don't train them in the Granite State or rural Iowa, they aren't going to move there later. Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa, did something similar but for the business side. She named Hans Jewelers in Iowa City as the Senate Small Business of the Week. It's a fifth-generation family business that started in 1853 by repairing watches for railroad workers.
I love the detail that they survived because railroad workers needed perfectly synchronized watches to keep the trains from crashing. It's a reminder that small businesses are often the bedrock of a town's history. Ernst focused on the transition from Bill Nusser Jr. to his son, Charlie. It's that generational succession that is so hard for small retail businesses to get right.
Switching gears to the personal side of the House, Representative Randy Fine, a Republican from Florida, took a minute to recognize his son Jacob's 18th birthday. It was a rare moment of vulnerability on the floor. Fine mentioned that he actually decided to run for office 6 years after Jacob was born, inspired by something his son dealt with as a first grader.
He made a point that we hear a lot from members but rarely see in the record, that while members give up a lot to serve, it is their families that give up even more. Jacob is back in Florida, while his dad is in D.C. for the session. It's a small, humanizing beat in the middle of a very professional, very high-friction day.
But that friction was definitely present elsewhere. Senator Mazie Hirono, a Democrat from Hawaii, introduced S-Con Res 31, which is a fairly blistering resolution about the duty of Congress to meet the needs of working women. It's not just a set of goals. It's a direct critique of the current administration's labor policies.
It lists 10 specific commitments, from equal pay to reproductive health care. But it also calls out what it describes as the gutting of federal agencies, with majority women workforces, through mass layoffs. It cites Bureau of Labor Statistics data showing that over 455,000 women exited the workforce in 2025. It's a marker for the Democrats' economic platform heading into the next cycle.
And it contrasts with the administrative paperwork we saw flowing from the executive branch. The House received 7 formal communications from agencies like the EPA, the FTC, and the Department of Agriculture. One from the Federal Trade Commission was particularly interesting. It was a final rule revising the negative option rule and removing the non-compete rule to comply with recent federal court decisions.
That's the administrative state retreating in real time. When the courts strike something down, the agencies have to formally unwrite the rules and notify Congress. It's the quiet aftermath of those huge judicial battles we see in the headlines. Speaking of battles, we should look at the town of Chelsea, Maine. Senator Susan Collins, a Republican from Maine, commemorated its 175th anniversary.
Wait, what's the connection to the administrative machine there?
It's the history of veteran care. Chelsea is home to the Tokus Veterans Hospital, which President Abraham Lincoln established as the first federal facility dedicated to caring for veterans. Collins called Chelsea an absolute pearl of the state, but she was really highlighting that Maine has been at the forefront of the federal government's obligation to service members since the Civil War.
It's a consistent theme in the record from yesterday, Wednesday, this sense of duty and the institutional weight of the past. Whether it's 205 years of Greek democracy, 175 years of a Maine veterans hospital, or 29 years of a trade expert's career, the record is where Congress acknowledges that it's part of a much longer timeline.
And that timeline continues today. The Speaker pro tempore ended the session by announcing the upcoming voting schedule for H.Res. 1131. That's the rule that will govern the debate on the big Department of Homeland Security funding bill. They're setting the stage for 15-minute and 5-minute electronic votes to move the ball down the field.
The machine keeps grinding. It's not always pretty, and it's rarely fast. But when you look at the breadth of everything that happened yesterday, Wednesday, the nominations, the resignations, the jewelry stores, and the Greek revolutionaries, you see a government that is remarkably busy, even when it's supposedly stuck.
And that is our full rundown of the day in Congress, from the high-level policy wars to the quiet retirement of the people who make those policies work. The record tells the story of a building that never sleeps, even if it occasionally struggles to wake up.
A lot of ground covered today. I'm ready to see what the next session brings to the hopper.
We'll be here to track it. Thanks for joining us for this full session of Floor Notes.
We'll see you next time.